So I'll be presenting today a model that we're conceptualizing, which is tokenizing carbon markets, is setting the incentives, as Omar alluded to, and that between governmental and private sector stakeholders. Private sector stakeholders in the role of investing actually in energy or in carbon reduction, and governments providing those incentives. So first of all, what is our blockchain lab? We started about a year ago, based in Berlin, and with the aim to connect these two worlds that you see on the left and the right side. One world is the blockchain ecosystem, consisting of startups, of think tanks, of like Ethereum and IOTA and whoever is out there, and on the other side, governmental stakeholders who are grappling with this from the legal point of view, but as well whether they're considering whether governments can be actually users of decentralized distributed applications. And what we, as a sort of the intermediary in the middle, we want to disintermediate a lot, but what we would be doing in the middle is advising on the legal framework conditions, on the identity systems that match the physical world with the world of blockchains that contain information only, and including designing the incentive models and the business models around governing a more decentralized governance. One example how that can come into place is the land registry of Georgia, which currently has about 1 million Georgian land titles registered on the Bitcoin blockchain, and our role in that case was to advise the National Authority for Land Registries on their institutional and legal framework to accommodate such a solutions, which is there to give the landowners a bit more safety and security against possible disappropriation of their land. What did we learn after 1 year working in the lab? We have looked actually at a lot of different use cases and a lot of different startups and other ideas floating around. There's really a lot of hot air in the air. That's mostly driven by the business model that many startups have chosen to launch a token and then invest massively into marketing that token, and that produces obviously a lot of hot air if there is no real business model, as Omar alluded to, behind the actual startup. So a lot of hot air. What else did we notice? We noticed that in many cases we didn't see such a great added value of the distributed architecture of a blockchain as opposed to a centralized architecture of a database. So we've seen, for example, many supply chain use cases where in the supply chain there's usually one entity, one buyer, usually it's an importer or the retailer that has a lot of market power and that is not really interested in giving away all that control over the information on the supply chain, and therefore that strongest market power in the supply chain will always decide for a more private solution, which is a database. What we've also noticed is that in some cases centralized decision making is actually producing better results than the distributed character of the blockchain. That is the case when we were analyzing, can we finance journalism through a blockchain solution? And we found out, okay, there's examples such as Steemit, but in fact I prefer a newspaper editorial, which is a centralized organization in terms of looking at the outcome over the results of this distributed curation market. So these were the downturns, but then how did we deal with it? So in the end, we're the blockchain lab, so how do we go about it? We thought, okay, what are the main properties that blockchains can deliver? This is it's digital accountability, it provides market mechanisms, and it provides an incentive layer, and it provides a way to decentralize decision making. And that way, when we address a certain problem, so rather than saying, okay, we have the hammer, and now every problem looks like a nail, so sort of like the solution searching for a problem, which is a common thing in the blockchain world, we rather start with a problem, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, and then look how can we address that problem, maybe looking beyond the existing institutional and legal framework, beyond the existing mechanisms that govern the problem, and how can we decentralize it using that electronic accountability, incentives, and market mechanisms. And so the result of that can be blockchain innovation, whereas the technical implementation in the end can be a blockchain, can be a database, can be a cloud solution, can be something else. We don't really care so much about the detail because we're not funded by an ICO, and therefore we're free to choose the architecture. So what we noticed, what the projects that have really demonstrated practical added value on the ground are mostly projects relating to using blockchain as a way to timestamp on a sort of immutable ledger. That's the case for land registries and several other public sector accountability projects, such as public procurement is also another good example. And then we have found a couple of interesting projects that decentralize marketplaces, such as energy marketplaces or insurance marketplaces or others, where we see an added value. This is a publication that is recently finalized. I think within a week or so you will find it on that website, including you find that list of use cases that we found to have some degree of added value. Now this is about climate. How do we set incentives to reduce carbon emissions? It's a very political topic. On the one side, you have a lot of schools these days demonstrating to save the climate. On the other side, you have all other demonstrating for the right to not save the climate and to use cheap fuel in their cars. It is a very political, contentious issue, and that makes it very tricky to develop sound climate policies. So how can we categorize the climate policies that really work on the ground? Of course, you can always rely on consumer behavior that voluntarily maybe will fly less on their holidays or use their car a bit less. But then what are the mechanisms that states can do? You can set rules, like building codes are very good ways to make buildings more energy efficient. Or you can put a tax on carbon. That's what happens with fuel taxes. It's politically usually very tricky. And you can also, instead of taxation, you can subsidize. You can subsidize renewable energy, as people do in Germany. And you can subsidize other sorts of investments into carbon mitigation. And that's an example at the global level. One of the great outcomes from the Paris Accords for climate saving is the Green Climate Fund, which is based in South Korea. And that's a way to subsidize investments that reduce carbon emissions. And they have currently about 150 projects worldwide. And so that's the only sort of mechanism that really has a meaningful impact at the global level, providing financial incentives to do carbon mitigation. And then you have a couple of other mechanisms that combine the taxation and the subsidy in a way of a marketplace, such as the European or in California as well. They have one sort of cap and trade scheme where you're trading climate credentials. Now, this is the concept that we're working on currently, which is somehow orienting itself on the GCF, on the Green Climate Fund. However, we looked at how can we add some value by tokenizing the whole scheme. So let me guide you through that process. You have a company, in this example, it's a Pakistani steel producer that is doing an investment to change their production method to reduce 10,000 tons of carbon emissions. And by doing that, they put a claim, represented by a token, claim that this reduction has taken place. And then you have another company who's auditing that it has actually taken place on the ground with their digital signature, will validate the actual reduction. And through that validation, and by being recognized as a certified auditor, that will trigger the subsidy at a global sort of fund, which is then managed in a sort of fund management, which will turn that carbon reduction claim into actual economic value, which can be translated and exchanged into fiat money. So that's the sort of scheme we're looking at. It's a way of subsidizing positive impact. The properties of such impact markets, as compared to the more institutionalized form of subsidy, is that you can use market mechanisms to actually find the cheapest way of reducing carbon. So because there's a demand side and a supply side to the market, the demand side are governments or maybe philanthropists or other people that want to invest money into carbon reduction, and the supply side is all these different projects, whether it be in solar energy, whether it be in steel production and all these other examples. And the market will make sure that the cheapest way to reduce carbon emissions will get the actual funding. So that would be the advantage of having ideally a marketplace attached to it. And there are some methods of carbon reduction, for example, planting trees or preventing deforestations, which actually are easy to measure and easy to automate in their measurement. So you can use some aerial images to look at the degree of deforestation, and then basically automatically, based on that image data, trigger the subsidy payment. So that's the sort of automation that can work in some cases, and that makes the market a bit more efficient and then easier to integrate into smart contracts that would automatically trigger payments. An additional added value is whatever happens on the blockchain usually is quite transparent and visible to anybody, so it's easier to track where the subsidy actually ends up. And the last one is when you use the traditional forms of financing, you're bound to, or it's very hard to reach certain regions of the world, maybe Venezuela or North Korea or other places which are hard to reach. But these tend to be the places that are not so accessible through traditional finance. They're actually massively active in promoting the adoption of cryptocurrency. So it might be a mechanism to reach achieve impact in those places which are hard to reach by normal means. All right, that's all. Thank you.